weirdest story about Zencaster. It's founded by some Harvard historian, would you believe?
Oh, really?
So this guy was obviously doing podcasts and thought there has to be a better way of doing this. And so he stopped being a Harvard history professor and founded Zencaster.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. It's very good. It's very dead easy.
It is dead easy.
You do these a lot, so you must have come across it before.
Yeah, there's one other one which someone started using, but I think Zencaster works so well, and the business of having the local uploads works very elegantly.
Yeah, it's dead simple.
Dead simple.
Dead simple. So thanks very much for doing this, Rory. As you know, when we did it last time, it was a bit stop-start, and then I kind of walked away with half the questions asked, but then a bonus 45 minutes on what advertising was. So it took me a while. So I was thinking, what do I do with that? Do I add another bit to the end? But I put it out, and I've had endless people saying that was fascinating. When's the next part? So this is it. So I'll remind you of what we did. In case you can't remember.
No. It was a while back. It was pre-COVID days.
It was pre-COVID, before we knew about such a thing. And basically, I'll remind you what we were doing. So I was trying to give you a sort of binary questions to say, we're starting an agency and you've got to choose A or B. What do you go for? So I've got some of your answers, for example. So do you employ misfits or very well-adjusted people? I think you chose misfits.
Yeah.
Would you choose ability over diversity? You went for ability. Experience over, and then I put in quote marks, freshness. And I think you'd chosen experience. And then gut over data, and you chose gut. So you've got a chance to change those answers before I mark them.
Well, I mean, they're interesting because both of them, for example, diversity and ability, both of them, in some ways, an agency wants a mix of both. And actually, an agency being a home of extremes, particularly the experience versus freshness one, that's a particularly interesting case, because in some ways, you know, a combination of enthusiasm and ignorance can take you to places which the more experienced won't go. You know,
absolutely.
Undoubtedly true. That, you know, I mean, that's true in entrepreneurialism. There's a certain form of entrepreneur who, in a sense, gets lucky by being stupid, because you don't know the normal rules of the category. So you do something which no sane, experienced person would do. Now, let's be candid here. 9 times out of 10, that fails, or even 99 times out of 100. But when it succeeds, of course, you find yourself in an uncontested market. You know, you've got a business that's offering something that nobody else thought to offer. And so, you know, Red Bull is my case in point for that. You know, no logical drinks company would market an inexpensive drink that most consumers said tasted horrible.
No.
You know, and obviously, you know, a lot of the time, I'm not suggesting that if you produced a horrible tasting drink, it would automatically be successful. But if you can somehow succeed with a weird tasting drink, you're going to be in a much more unusual category than, say, you know, conventional lemonade.
That's true. I guess, as you say, some companies do fantastically well out of not knowing the rules, but generally they're sort of one-hit wonders. Even I would include in the one-hit wonders Facebook and possibly even Google, massive hits, but they rarely replicate.
No, and you're right. It's actually, I mean, a lot of people who have those one-hit wonders spend the rest of their life trying to replicate it. My brother-in-law was a scriptwriter and worked for a time for Zyka, who created CSI. Of course, CSI was a fantastic crime property in the sense that you could have CSI, which was originally in Vegas, and then you had CSI Miami, and you had CSI New York, and the whole thing spun off, and the whole, you know, there were some, you know, fairly very innovative little things, you know, those extraordinary little 5 seconds of video where you showed a bullet slamming into someone's jugular or whatever it might be in kind of slow motion. And you had the slightly weird thing, which is it's one of those interesting things which anybody who has any experience of law enforcement knows is rubbish, right? Okay, so forensic pathologists don't investigate crimes, okay?
No.
Fairly basic rule, right? And secondly, they're not all fantastically attractive either, I would assume, just by the law of averages, unless there's something
right, yeah.
unless there's something going on in the selection for forensic pathology that I don't know about. I imagine that not all of them are, drop dead gorgeous. But you can somehow get away with those two complete kind of contrivances, and the public will just about go along with you. It's rather like this. I've got a friend who's a doctor who can't stand watching House, you see,
right.
Because if you actually know about medicine, a lot of the stuff in the House strikes her as extremely dubious.
Right.
But of course, we know little enough that we can just about be hoodwinked by the idea that teams of fantastically attractive forensic pathologists go around actually investigating crimes, breaking into people's homes. I suppose exactly the same thing applies with, say, Waking the Dead. There's an element of nonsense which is factored in just to essentially, just to make the thing watchable. Because obviously having a load of people in a laboratory all the time wouldn't be that interesting.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing with Zyko is, he spent the whole time trying to replicate it, and I don't think ever has. And to be absolutely honest, I would have taken the $500 million and gone into a completely different field, I think.
Absolutely, probably got just as much chance, if not more, of replicating it.
Yeah, launch a hotel chain or something. Yeah.
But the interestingly, and this is the quote I couldn't remember of yours when we spoke last time, but this is where that question of experience over freshness had come from, because I love this quote that you said, and I've got it here. Advertising, by failing to ally itself to any recognizable science or body of knowledge, does not really pay a premium for the experience.
No.
There is no mental framework on which you can hang a lifetime of accumulated experience. This means we habitually value youth and vitality over wisdom and maturity. So we can't charge as much as other businesses because of that very reason.
What do you think, when you've been in advertising for 25 years, what do you think the gift is? My hunch is that I'm not sure you're actually better at generating brilliant ideas. You're much faster at rejecting areas which aren't worth exploring, I think.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, for me personally, I think over time, there's a number of things happen. The things that I find helpful for me personally is that I think as a creative, when you get into a creative department, most people, if they're any good, are a bundle of nerves, and they're worried that they're not going to be able to do it. And I think that's why often creatives get so tense when their work isn't sold, because they think, well, what if I can't come up with another idea? And then I think over time, when you answer briefs and you're more comfortable in that, you become more open to taking in other points of view and other opinions. And I think that obviously is really valuable, because you're taking in a wider range of stuff rather than desperately trying to do what you think's right.
The paranoia, by the way, is very understandable, because in a weird kind of way, you're trying to solve a problem where you don't quite know what the problem is, and there's more than one right answer, so you never quite know if you've got there or not. There was a wonderful piece, I think, by Peter Thiel, who obviously founded a lot of tech companies, and he said tech people are very unsympathetic towards marketing. But he said the marketing people actually have a tougher job than an engineer does, because an engineer has a clearly defined problem and can know with complete certainty when they've solved it. Yeah. Because there's more than one right answer in engineering, but by and large, you do know when you've got there. And
you can prove it works.
And you can kind of say, okay, well, this will work. Now maybe we need to do something better. I always quite like that approach. I can't remember who the creative team were, but they were in the D&AD copybook, where their approach was, when they got a brief, they used to do a David Ogilvy ad, as they called it, slightly rudely, if I may say so.
Yeah.
But I get they called it a how, what, why, where ad. And they'd put that up on the wall, and it would say, why, da-da-da-da-da-da-dum, or how, da-da-dum, okay? And it was a kind of, bit of a long copy, explanatory, editorial type ad, okay? And they'd put that up on the wall, and they'd basically say, right, that's good, that'll work, okay? Now we've got to beat it. And passing aside the mild disrespect for David Ogilvy they showed by calling it a David Ogilvy ad, I thought that was quite an interesting approach, which is, okay, that will do the job. nobody will feel cheated if we put that ad up. Now our task is to see something that can work just as well, or better, but in a vastly more unexpected space.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good approach, because having some fallback position is probably useful,
I think it's interesting. I think that is a really good approach, but that's probably an approach that not many creatives would use, because it feels it's sort of professional. It doesn't feel spontaneous. It doesn't feel creative, does it? But no. It's professional. I mean, I often will, when I'll go through teams' work, and sometimes you'll get very creative stuff, and I will say, well, if I was the client, I would just say this, and then whatever the brief was, because it would be dead clear. It may be boring, but everybody would know what you're talking about. Whereas you've taken it so far away into this interesting area that it's very creative. But why would you run that if you were the client? And then somehow the goal is to do something as clear as that the client may do, but as interesting as what they do.
As someone in their 50s, do you confess something, which is when you go around the Cannes awards, there are 4 or 5 ads which you don't understand?
Oh, yeah. I have to confess 4 or 5.
Exactly. I was setting it conservatively low, but there's some ads which are, in a sense, utterly beautiful as pieces of conceptual art.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, I kind of, and of course, because they're in Cannes, there's something brilliant to look for. Okay,
yeah.
So you go, okay, well, someone's obviously spotted something extraordinary about this. It's on the shortlist. So let me devote now, rather like doing a cryptic crossword, let me now devote 5 minutes of my time to cracking it.
Yeah.
And then there are ads which are, Mercedes skid mark, which are just at the right level of crypticness.
It's interesting, that one, because my friend did that, and I didn't get that. First off, I have to admit, I didn't get it. When I can still remember my reaction to it, because I thought, you can tell exactly what you say. You can tell by the fact that it's so simple and so well produced that someone loves it, and it's obviously good. But I couldn't figure out why. I was thinking, is it something to do with parking or what's? I couldn't kind of figure it out first, and then somebody explained it pretty soon.
A friend of mine, Harvey Lee, who now works in San Francisco, overheard 2 people when first exposed to the first Economist poster, management trainee, aged 42, and he overheard 2 people on a tube platform, one of them explaining the ad to the other.
Yeah.
Now, if you're not versed in management trainee thing, speak. If you're not, versed in business speak to any degree, you wouldn't understand what that was about, really. Because and also, let's be honest. If you're, there are a lot of people aged 42 who, having worked, shelf stacking for 20 years, would be delighted to be put on a management training course at the age of 42. So that's kind of, it's kind of contextually dependent, that ad, I think.
But I think it would be. I think not enough people admit that they don't get supposedly really good ads. So I can remember, I think Dave Trot saying that when the Benson and Hedges gold box, what was it, the Surreal gold box came out, he was in Tottenham Court Road staring at it, and there was the one with the mouse hole and the gold box outside. And he said, on the previous campaign was all about puns, and he was thinking, well, why is it? Is Benson and Hedges now cheese? What's the, and he's trying to rationalize it. He just trying to figure it out. What was the pun? And he just couldn't get any sense of it. And I think it's a bit like the Economist one or whatever. It's good. People should put their hands up and say, I don't get it, rather than think,
yes,
I'll keep quiet, and then eventually I'll get it, and I can pretend I'm really cool, rather than, because that's part of whether these things work or not. But I think, we're sometimes so worried about how we,
it's always fascinating too on international juries, which is, one of the reasons I always think that, Cannes is a bit art director heavy, is that, there are certain nuances, particularly in copy or tonality, which, you simply can't explain really to people who haven't grown up with them, So I remember judging one piece which the Australians loved and the Brits loved, which was really all about Aussie-Brit rivalry, you see.
Right.
Now, that Aussie-Brit sledging has been going on for sort of 50 years. And, we understand completely the context within which the ad appears, whereas to them it would be as baffling to me as, say, Spanish Venezuelan repartee.
Yeah, absolutely,
I just wouldn't understand what the hell they were going on about. I'm sure that the Spanish have preconceptions of Venezuelans or Colombians and vice versa. But
that's an interesting point, because I think that what's happened with Cannes, and this is one of my questions to do with awards, it's initially said can or no can, but I think those kind of ads have gradually vanished because they don't do very well in Cannes for exactly the reason you say.
Right.
I was on one of these international juries once, and I had an Adidas ad up that we'd obviously spent ages writing whatever the line was, and because I couldn't, obviously I was the English juror, I couldn't talk about it, so I stood to one side. All of the other people there, they sort of nominated the person who spoke the best English, which I think was a Norwegian, who tried to explain what this ad meant. And I think the ad said something about eating tarmac or something, I can't remember it. And he said, well, it's kind of it's for running shoes, and it's about going out and running. And you think, how on earth is anybody ever going to vote for that? And I think what's happened is, because everything's gone global in terms of awards, all of the sort of local idiosyncrasies and personality has been ironed out. So there's a they call it a sort of Cannes style ad now, which means it's on the one hand universal, but on the other hand doesn't really have that personality that The Economist or whatever used to have, because
it's this weird trade-off, isn't it, which is that as someone said, the world gets more diverse locally, but it gets less diverse globally. So if you like, you can get, if you're in London, you can get, French food, Italian food, Chinese food, Korean food. And in some ways, that's great when you're in London. But at the same time, when you then travel 7,000 miles, you find you get French food, Italian food, pizza, Chinese food. And you're kind of going, at some point, we've actually, within a specific point, things are kind of more varied, but actually everything globally then becomes more homogeneous. And it's a trade-off, actually.
Well, it's a shame, because, I mean, this is one of the questions. So if you had a choice that you could kill awards or you could keep them going in this kind of new advertising world, which would you choose? Do you think they're beneficial?
I support them in general, and two ways. A, there's an element to it which is like catwalk fashion. Okay, not many people wear catwalk fashion, but the fashion houses use it to show what they can do. And there's a kind of, inspiration in that. And catwalk fashion, in some cases, makes its way into the mainstream, But, I mean, if you're a couture house in Paris, the number of customers for actual haute couture is probably 10,000 people globally. It ain't Zara. It's, it's not TK Maxx, right? It's a really, really abstruse and weird thing. But at the same time, it has what the French would, see as a kind of, rather like extreme forms of cuisine. It's an example of what you can do. I think where it goes wrong is a weird one, which is there's a great thing called Goodhart's law, which is any metric that becomes a target loses its value as a metric. Yeah. And if I were a client, I'd want to appoint an agency that had won some awards, okay? Because you want to know that given the right circumstances, they can produce that kind of work, okay? But that's not the same as saying that the be-all and end-all of a creative department should be to produce award-winning work. So it's right, it's a bit like that. If you employed a chef, it would mean something that he could produce something, make a souffle rise or whatever it is that's particularly difficult in chef world. Okay, and that matters, but that doesn't mean you only offer souffle. Okay, you don't become, the Gregs of souffle, and and so I think it's a metric, and you want your agency to be capable of doing that kind of work. And if they never do that kind of work, it's kind of cause for alarm, because, but equally it should be a metric, not a target.
Yeah, I like that. Goodhart's law. I don't know that.
So it's really useful, actually, because it means that when you set metrics for things, generally what happens is people start to game the system.
So obviously, if following Goodhart's law, there are many more metrics around awards now than they used to be. They used to be given out and it was a nice thing to get, whereas now there's tables compiled, there's all sorts of there are all sorts of metrics built around awards and who's top and where they are than they used to be. So presumably you would think that over the last, say, 20 years, they've become a little bit corrosive is too strong a word, but not as beneficial as they were. Or do you
I think that there is a danger of a kind of distortion, which is that if you were a fashion house, you'd want people to be able to produce couture clothing, or maybe you want people to aspire to do it. But patently, most of the fashion industry is it's a tiny sliver of the fashion industry if you look at it, catwalk fashion. And in the same way, you have to acknowledge it wouldn't hurt. David Ogilvy always wanted every copywriter to spend the first 4 years of their working life working in direct response.
Right.
And the argument was that direct response does ground you, in the basics of advertising. In other words, what is persuasive? What information do people know before they can make a decision? The other thing that bothers me about it a bit is that it may have a distorting effect on the kind of ads. I mean, long copy press ads should still exist. Okay, right. Yeah. Right. I mean, I'm not one of the. I don't want to sound like some old fart going back in the good old days.
No, but
you could sit down and. But if you take those the reason I went into advertising was really the CDP ads. Funnily enough, partly the ones on TV, but it was partly the double page stuff they did in the Sunday Times.
Right.
The Sunday Times colour magazine. Typically, when I was a teenager, or even before then, when I was kind of 11 or 12, I'd fight with my brother to get the Sunday Times colour magazine to read the ads. Okay, we weren't fighting over the article about the war in Uganda or whatever it was. We were fighting to read the ads, and typically, what I didn't know then, obviously, but I know now, is that half the ads we were fighting over were kind of Parker pens. What was it? Clark's. There was a Clark's Polyvelt shoe, wasn't there?
Oh, I remember those. Yeah,
you remember those?
This Polyvelt has done 10,000 miles.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, those were the kind of things with 200 words of body copy, so to add a little bit of reassurance and also a little bit of character and personality to the ad. So it wasn't just a shout,
Yeah. It was persuasive. Funnily enough, I was going to ask you, because when I listened to our last podcast, I was curious about what the ads were that you talked about that CDP had done that was in Private Eye, and I couldn't remember them, and that wasn't on the recording. It was like very small ads, and I remember you talking about it, but I couldn't remember who they were.
This was an extraordinary, clever idea, which I've never seen replicated. But CDP, I think it must have been CDP, because Paul Smith remembers the account, I think. They must have had a tiny account from the Harris Tweed, Marketing Association. Yeah. And the ad, which appeared in things like the Private Eye and the Spectator, in something little bigger than a classified space. I mean, it really was like 2 inches, 2 column inches, or maybe 3, simply said that if you could send them a reference to Harris Tweed in a published work of fiction, they'd send you a free Harris Tweed hat.
Right.
I think it might have been a deerstalker. I'm not even sure it wasn't a deerstalker hat. The extraordinary thing.
Did you send something in, Rory?
Well, the weird thing was, it was something like 7 years before I found a reference to Harris Tweed, a Harris Tweed coat. Would you believe it, I think I was reading a bit of kind of that terribly unfashionable now, kind of boys' own adventure things. Bulldog Drummond, I think it was.
Oh, I remember that.
I was reading a Bulldog Drummond story, and there was, I think, a villain in there, or possibly the hero, in a Harris Tweed, belted Harris Tweed overcoat. And I read it and thought, shit, I could have got the hat. But of course, by then I'd lost the ad. I had no clue where to send the reference to. But what was interesting about that is every time you came across a reference to Tweed in any written publication for the next 3 years, you remembered that ad. It was kind of
how effective was that ad for you to be on your mind for 7 years?
I know.
And obviously the sort of the feeling around that would be that it's special and it's been talked about in literature and other places. So it brings with it a lot of things for a little tiny,
of course, it's fascinating.
20 double ad.
It's pre-Google, of course. That's the fascinating thing that dates it. Because, of course, now you could just presumably just go Harris Tweed, Google Books, Google, and you'd find 407 references to Harris Tweed in
absolutely.
But it was a fabulous thing, a really fabulous thing.
And also, it's interesting what you say about obviously the press has advertising's got an issue because of the numbers declining, but that isn't necessarily linked to people reading less. I would argue people read more than they used to.
No. If you include time reading the web, if you include also
reading words, I'm just counting words,
and then
people read more. But there's a sort of feeling that you shouldn't explain anything, whether it's on social media or whatever, just have pictures. But people are reading, I think people take in more words now than they did 20, 30 years ago.
And if you look at it, of course, you could extend that to things like podcasts, talk radio, and even rap is a long copy medium, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So no one really predicted, did they, that that is a copywriter's medium to some extent.
Yeah.
So no, I mean the idea that words are dead is completely crazy.
But we're not, as you probably saw recently, D&AD closed stopped doing the copy section, the word section, effectively. But
what was behind that, Jen? Truly,
I don't know. I don't know. I just don't think it was very thought through. I mean, it's obviously as you say, the benefit of awards is that people aspire to win these things or to be good at certain things. Why there isn't more pressure to be good at writing and using words, wherever it appears? Who cares?
I mean, interestingly, one defense of Cannes is because Cannes is, to be honest, annoyingly enormous. It's a bit of a winner-takes-all phenomenon. And they're often attacked, understandably, for being a bit greedy by having too many categories. And so the large agencies have to enter everything 17 times. And I get that. The only thing about the explosion of categories is that no smaller awards could have so many categories. It simply couldn't sustain it, okay? No. And the one great thing about those categories is that it does increase the chances that something that's really ingenious and brilliant, but which defies conventional categorization, can get recognized.
Yeah, I suppose I find almost the opposite, which is there are so many categories now that
you don't know what's good anymore.
You don't really. People don't seem to know what won as much as they used to, because it would be less, but it would get a bigger light shone on it. So people would not be aware that, those guys won this or that agency won that. Whereas now it seems to be one big splurge of everybody seems to win. It just, I don't know. And the other aspect of awards, I mean, I'm not sure about awards. I used to be very awards focused. And I mean, one of the things that I think is a big difference between how awards used to be then and now is generally the very well-known stuff used to win awards, whereas now it's the stuff you've never seen for whatever reason.
Of course, it's worth remembering that it's easy to be fairly offhand about awards once you've won some.
Yeah.
What I generally notice is people who've won quite a lot then say, okay, to give my life meaning going forwards, it's a bit like being a made man in the mafia. You know that scene in Goodfellas where Tommy goes in thinking he's going to be made and ends up in a basement room getting shot in the back of the head.
Terrific.
Terrific, absolutely sensational. I mean, one of the it's one of those bits of film, which is always an area of interest to me, which is what are those things that makes a film rewatchable? It's a wonderful, Goodfellas is perhaps the most rewatchable film of the 90s. Ferris Bueller's Day Off is another one. There are certain films, my kids absolutely love it. My kids more or less memorize the script. And that particular thing that makes something so powerful. But as I said, it's quite easy. When you've won a few awards, you've effectively got made man status, and you can afford to then change your focus because you're there. You're Billy Batts. You're part of a crew.
Billy Bats, doesn't he get
Yeah,
beaten to death?
He's the chap who gets beaten. That's why I
Yeah.
think Tommy was killed, because Billy Bats was a made man. And even though Billy Bats was a bit of an asshole, there were two different crews, whether it was the Gambino family and the Cabresi family. I'm a bit rusty on this stuff. But I think the fact was the fact that Tommy had killed a made man without the prior agreement of the capo. That was what meant he had to be killed, effectively, as a kind of... as a kind of reckoning. And even though, Billy Bats was patently a bit of an ass, the rules still applied. You had that sanctity of being of status. And so, I think you're right. I mean, one of the good reasons to win awards is that you don't, I always remember some bloke saying, to me, one of the good reasons to go to Oxford or Cambridge is you don't have a chip on your shoulder about not having been there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one of the good reasons to win awards is you can then become reasonably dispassionate about the whole thing instead of being obsessed by it.
Well, I find when I judge awards, generally the people who've won quite a lot of awards want to give out more than the people who haven't.
Yeah, that would make sense.
They're not quite as... I think there's, occasionally I've been on awards juries where there's, there'll be someone who doesn't seem to want to win an award, give an award for anything. And
you did Lucky Star, didn't you? For
my agency did Lucky Star, yeah. CDD.
Now that was, in my opinion, the greatest ad of the decade, and yet it got almost no recognition at all. Because to me, it was utterly revolutionary to produce an ad which appeared to be an ad for something else.
Yeah, I think that was Walter. I think it was probably it's done too early. I think if a couple of years' time when the internet was, I think that was 2002.
Interesting.
So probably slightly too early for the internet, but I think, but did very well. Lots of people, I would have friends at the time who would say they want to see that film Lucky Star. It looks really good. And I think it was obviously the idea of it. As I say, it was Walt did that, but the idea of it was to give, Mercedes had gone down this path of saying, because they had loads of models, saying a Mercedes is for everyone now because they now had cheaper models. Yeah. Whereas we said, look, it should be the opposite. It should still be special. It just shouldn't be, they're buying into the fact that it's a special club. You don't want to say now it's just anybody can have one. So it was to try and give it some glamour and make it special. So
which it did brilliantly.
That was the plan.
It's interesting. That is, by the way, that is always an issue with awards, which is you can be too early. And undoubtedly that's true. That there are certain things which, if you're too ahead of your time, no one quite gets what's going on.
Well, that's it. That's exactly what John Hegarty said when I did one of these with him. He said that if you do truly innovative work, it doesn't win any awards because people don't know what to make of it. They've got no reference point.
And I think that was a classic case in point, because I mean, because it struck me as utterly unprecedented to produce an ad which was an ad for something else. I may be able to dig into the annals of advertising and find other cases, but I can't think of any where anybody's done that. And I asked, it didn't go anywhere at D&AD, and I asked the chap who was in charge of the judges, and he said that people didn't get it.
Yeah. I think it got in, but it didn't. Yeah, it certainly didn't win anything.
No. Because that was black pencil shit for me. That was just, okay, off the charts.
If only you were judging.
I wasn't. I was actually on the jury, but I was in some different category.
Different category, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to put you down as a pro awards guy. Let's keep these things going.
Yeah, as a metric, but not as the sole target.
Yeah, I like your fashion house, your couture house example.
Also,
trends and examples come from that. But
one good thing about COVID is that if you make Cannes a bit more virtual, which all of those events will have to be available online. I always did feel going to Cannes as a 53-year-old that it isn't me who needs to be here; it's the people who are 27.
Yeah.
And I did always feel that the extraordinary expense of the thing Obviously, they do a bit to counterbalance that with young lions and so on and so forth. But I always did feel that going around and looking at the work as a 54-year-old, it was a bit of a wasted opportunity. I'd done it 9 times already. And, I'd really rather give my place over to somebody else. But it's training. I mean, I always said, in a way, we have an awards budget, but our awards budget is partly a training budget, seeing what everybody else is doing, what the greatest work is. One thing I do miss is that if you think about it, I miss those countries where their advertising used to be completely unlike anybody else's. France used to be like that, okay?
Yeah.
And, if you think about it, there are those, French, Art Deco poster advertising of the 1930s. I think there are Dubonnet posters which change hands for $250,000 and things like this. And there were hand-painted things, and there were, extraordinary kind of artistry for things like the Normandy or, transatlantic sailings. And the French just did advertising in a completely different way to anybody else, and they didn't give a shit, And I miss that a bit. I do miss that.
Absolutely. Well, I used to love all the Jean-Paul Goude stuff where he did Kodak, he did Lee Jeans. I don't know if you remember any of that from the sort of 80s. It would be it would just be nothing like England, as you say. Whereas it does seem to have become homogenized, or at least the stuff that you see in the awards has become homogenized. So I'm going to pin you down for another question here, Rory. Specialism or 360? What do you go for?
Me, personally, 360 every time.
Would you really?
Yeah. And the reason for that is at the age of 54, the reason I started a behavioral science practice is I like looking at the whole problem. Okay. Right. I like looking at the whole equation and trying to understand the business as a system. And it's a bit like Dave Trot's point where he says not everything's brand. Okay, he criticized agencies because he said every single discussion would start with brand. And by the way, the problem about talking about brand is you end up only talking to the marketing director, not the chief executive or the finance director or anybody else. Okay, but he said, as he quite rightly said, not every business problem is a brand problem. And I always prefer starting with behavior as an objective than perception. Because it's a more open-ended question, and it leaves a bigger potential solution space. I'll give you a lovely example of this. Okay, this is why I want to be 360. This is work done by my own team. I can't claim much credit to it except encouragement, which was a very, very successful. We've got the results. I can't reel them off the top of my head. Campaign to encourage recycling in London, and the whole campaign is one bin is rubbish. Because our point was, look, we're always trying to encourage people to recycle, but that's actually a fake thing. First of all, people aren't as altruistic as we think they are, or as they claim to be, okay? Secondly, it doesn't matter how altruistic and well-intentioned you are. If you've only got one bin, you won't separate out your rubbish. If you've got two bins, even quite shitty, if you put Jeremy Clarkson in a flat with 2 bins, he'll basically put the food in one place and he'll put the tins in the other, okay? Whereas you could put a committed member of Extinction Rebellion in a holiday villa for 3 weeks with only 1 bin, and on about day 4, they'd be going, oh, fuck this, forget us, I'll just... Yeah. And so the campaign was, let's get people to get 2 bins. Let's not talk about polar bears or climate or whatever. And I always like to be able to roam free and say, where's the real problem here?
Well, I suppose I would challenge that, though, and say that I would say that what you're saying is you would go with us. If we're talking about Sutherland and Sutherland, then your specialism would be behavioural.
Yeah, so
rather than, I suppose most agencies try and present a front that they can do everything, but they're specialists in nothing. Whereas obviously you're a specialist in behavioural. You're better at that than.
Yes, I never thought of that. It's a great thing to do because at the age of about 48, okay, it's time for me to move aside, or I was about 46. I can't sit there being creative director of Ogilvy One as I then was. There are a load of talent beneath me who needs to take over the reins, okay? And being able to reinvent yourself in something which lets you parlay everything you've learned in advertising, but into a different field, is a great it's a great second run on the hamster wheel, for
Absolutely.
me.
Why? I would have thought if I'm explaining your job to someone outside of advertising, they wouldn't believe that didn't exist for the last 100 years. It seems so integral to the very point of advertising.
Do you know, one of the other things is that I always assumed that it did exist. And so when I was busy just looking at advertising solutions, I thought, well, there's no point in delving into this behavioral thing because these big companies, they employ, 50,000 people. They must have a department of behavioral experts or pricing experts or psychologists. Okay. I just assumed that the discipline existed and I just never bumped into anybody who worked in it. And it took me 15 or 20 years to realize, a bit like that line in Zulu, no, it's just us, only us. Okay. And ad agencies, I think ad agencies don't realize that in terms of external advisors to corporates who have the consumer psychological frame on a problem, not the kind of administrative mechanistic frame on the problem. The people who are looking at it through a customer's eyes rather than looking at it through the lens of a balance sheet, it is just us, okay? There isn't. I mean, okay, Apple would have some other people who are, Apple, patently a $1 trillion company, maybe no surprise, has some people who obviously are really, really good at that shit, and they're, and there are, other companies which I think Southwestern Airlines did for a time as well. Uber did. It had a behavioral science unit, which then closed down weirdly, which is a bit odd given that Uber's whole success really depended on a behavioral science insight, in my opinion, which was the map. Okay. People don't mind waiting for a taxi if you can see where it is. And so there's something I think ad agencies think, well, there must be loads of other people doing this other stuff. And you realize that even things like pricing, okay, they aren't done from a psychological angle at all. There are a bunch of accountants get together and say, it's $4.95. And one of the great things as a behavioral science angle is we go in and say, would it be better if you made it, 50p a month? Or, I'll tell you a very interesting story, which I can't claim any credit for apart from being far-sighted, okay? When I worked on charity business in direct marketing, for about 8 years before anybody did it, I said, look, you're always writing to people, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to get a £100 donation from 1% of the people you write to, or whatever it is. Okay. Why don't we write to people and just ask them for £2 a month? And try and get £2 a month from 40% of the people or 20% of the people.
Yeah.
Because you've got them. It's then much easier to upgrade them to a higher donation. But also, you've got a bit of engagement. In other words, it seems a more efficient use of direct mail somehow. And I used to rant on about this, and people looked at me as if I was a bit weird. And then it took another 8 years, total coincidence. I don't think I was the author of this in any way. Eventually, people did try the £2 a month direct debit. And it was, of course, the biggest thing in charity for 20 years.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I listened to this podcast. Did you ever get the magazine Word?
Do you know that I remember that, yeah.
Do you? Okay, so David Hepworth, the editor, was talking recently about, they closed that down. I used to really like Word magazine. And he said that I think recently he was commenting on the fact that a rapper had put out an album and was charging £70 rather than £15. And he said that's what they should have done with the Word. He said, because most magazines are, instead of trying to maximize what they can out of the people who really like them, they spend their life trying to talk to people who are sort of on the periphery. Yeah. So if they can charge 50p more an issue is a big problem. Whereas what they could have done is say, well, let's just say it's £20 an issue instead of £5. Most of the people who buy it would have continued buying it because they really liked it, rather than edging around the periphery of people who aren't really fans. So just
is,
charge more from who you've got than try and find a few more people who charge, who, if that makes sense.
There is one publication which does that, and I must admit I've never subscribed because it's too bloody expensive. But I think it's a travel publication, and it's called something like. It's not called Globalista, but it's called something like that. And it gives you incredibly niche travel advice. Now, if you think about it, okay, it's something like £200 a year or something. Maybe it's even more. But if you're the kind of person, and I'm not, who spends 10 grand on your holiday, okay, and what you want from that holiday is absolute exclusivity. You want to go back to Goldman Sachs and tell people you've done things which nobody else has done. Of course, the very expensiveness of that thing is actually a strength, not a weakness, because you know that hardly anybody else reads this bloody thing. So when I go back and say, actually, we had a dawn tour of the fish market in so and so, you can be fairly confident that A, it's a worthwhile thing to do, and B, that nobody else has done it. So in terms of bragging rights for your holiday, that's really rather clever. And I suppose framed against what you spend on travel, it's a relatively small expense. That's the way to set it.
Yeah, totally.
If you're going to spend 20 grand on a holiday, then spending £500 on reading about how to plan a good holiday, maybe not that crazy. I'm wondering whether it still exists, but I'll try and dig out a reference.
That's interesting. So on that question, then specialism, I'm sort of feel tempted to put you down as specialism because it feels like you're
okay.
Because I suppose it feels like now
the only contradiction to that is the first person to create a behavioural practice within an ad agency, although he didn't call it that, was Howard Luck Gossage in San Francisco in the 70s.
Oh, really? I know him, yeah.
And he called the company Generalists, Inc. Interesting, because he saw the kind of behavioural science practice as a way of looking at wider problems. So where I am a generalist is I will go in and what I like to do is actually ignore the brief completely and slightly, but root around, because one of the reasons I don't believe in specialism is I think one of the things we do is we solve problems that people didn't even know they had. And so that's where the problem comes about if you wait for a brief or if you define yourself too narrowly. People will only bring you pre-existing problems of which they're aware. And I think half the business problems out there, the business doesn't even know it's a problem.
So how many people do you think do that? Do you think lots of people do that?
The other people, very good account people do it, I think. And they're rare, okay? But the special breed of account man, which is probably diminishing because they're just younger, but you used to get those people who knew their client's business in and out and basically understood it from soup to nuts.
So I'm just going to keep pursuing it. So if not many people do it and very few account people do it, isn't it a specialism?
I suppose so. Okay. We're specialist generalists. Yeah.
Yeah. I suppose my contrast is I think it's fine for people to be very good at one thing rather than I suppose it's most agencies present themselves as we're great at everything, and often they're average at everything. They can do everything, but they're not world class often at anything. Whereas I suppose it's like creatives today have to do 10 different medias, present, get their decks together. They have to do a ton of things. Whereas if you say, what are you amazing at? What can you do better than anyone else? They would struggle. Whereas I think there used to be, I remember hearing about Paul Grubb apparently was amazing at end lines, or you would get, John Webster was brilliant at TV.
Great John was the pun master, wasn't he?
The pun master, yeah, exactly. I think
the famous one, you've ever heard this, which is someone was stuck because they thought they needed a good pun for their ad. And they shouted across the creative department, "Can you give me a pun, please, Gray?" To which Gray replied, "Do you want an old pun or a current pun?"
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, superb.
So the only thing I would say is that creative people are actually their creativity is much more widely applicable than briefs often allow them to be. So one thing I resist is you occasionally get this person, and it might be a client, might actually be an account person, goes, yeah, well, of course, the trouble with our creatives is all they want to do is win awards. And if there isn't a team... And my experience of creatives is there are one or two who are a bit like that. But the vast majority of them, if you give them a brief to solve a different problem, they'll bring exactly the same imagination to bear on a practical problem.
Yeah.
One of the things I noticed, by the way, just an interesting one, my dad was in the property industry. And generally, creative people are very interested in property because the whole property business is really about seeing what nobody else sees. It's seeing value in a place, and if you think about it, you get those hipster areas of London where it's creative people who move there first because they're the first people to spot the potential. And that's why you get, a mixture of creative people and artists and so forth, who are the kind of shock troops of gentrification in the property market, because they're the first people to spot, well, actually, it does look a bit run down, but there's a whole terrace of Georgian houses here, right?
Yeah, interesting.
And so I think that creative people generally bring a different eye to bear on lots of different problems, but actually we're often constrained by the nature of briefs.
Yeah, I think that's very true. People,
So if you hear people say, no, they just want to win awards, then I think that's not really a product of the creative people themselves. It's probably a result of the environment in which they've been put.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. So, right, the next one. So you're hiring people, and you've got to choose one or the other. Paranoid or confident?
Crikey, both. I mean, this is what is so interesting about the answer to all your questions.
He's both. That's why I'm asking it like this.
Yeah, exactly. They're murderous questions because, as with diversity or talent, okay, what you actually need is diverse talents.
Yeah, I think I just thought if I said, do you think we should have diverse agents? Nobody's ever going to say no. But it's just when that goes,
The paranoid or confident one is really interesting because I recognise that paranoia works. Okay, I just really don't like it. So one of the things I always noticed, I think BBH was a paranoid culture, wasn't it? Do you think?
Yeah.
I always
there was a. I'm just trying to think who the guy was who said. In fact, I shouldn't name him, but there was a planner there who had a really famous quote within BBH, which is, "It's not the right culture for black sheep," because it wasn't. Yeah, they didn't like people supposedly who did their own thing.
It's very strange, but there was a kind of. I noticed that anybody who came to Ogilvy from BBH, they were very, very good, but they had an incredibly strong instinct to beat themselves up. That it wasn't enough to be beaten up by someone else. You actually had to kind of, basically, everything you did was not nearly as good as it should have been, or not nearly as good as it could have been.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I respected it, and it patently works. Okay, it's just I couldn't have spent 30 years in such an environment. I don't think.
Yeah.
Because I'd almost feel, you'd almost feel you'd need to be deprogrammed, when you left.
Well, I suppose there's always the feeling that the creatives particularly, who are very confident, were generally not very good. And there's that quote of, I think it was Colin Millward saying, when he was creative director of Collets, he could always tell the creatives who were working very hard because he would walk down the corridor and they'd be sort of staring out the window aimlessly, not totally confident and dashing things off. They'd think, this is hard, I can't do it, and then you kind of break through. But
it's a weird one because what you need to do this job, I think, is the confidence to know that you can do it without the self-satisfaction to settle for, the second best. And so you have to believe that the problem is somehow solvable. You have to have enough optimism to believe that there's an answer out there somewhere, even when it's far from being apparent. Okay. So if you were totally kind of defeatist, you'd never even get out of bed in the morning in a way, because you just go, this is just all too hopeless and impossible. You have to believe that somewhere out there in the ether. I always like that phrase. I can't remember who said it, but there was a very good creative. It might have been John Hegarty, actually. So a brilliant creative who said that that ideas, you don't really have ideas. They're out there floating somewhere in the culture, and you kind of grab them out of the air. And you have to believe they're out there, but equally, you have to have the kind of, the natural anxiety to know that this isn't going to be easy to find them.
No, absolutely.
So that's really, and also, possibly, I mean, some of your dichotomies are cases where you want some of the people in the agency to be X and some of them to be Y.
Yeah, that's true. It would change according to departments,
and actually, even within a department, you might want a mix. Okay.
Yeah.
And then there's some of them where actually you need the same thing to be manifest within the same person at different modes.
Yeah. Well, I would have thought account management are probably you would want more confidence, and creatives maybe a little bit more paranoia.
Yeah, you might be right.
For example.
Yeah.
So, and the next one, bearing in mind that you can't have both, so you follow rules or you break rules. And I'm partly thinking back to your...
You break rules. I'll even refine that a bit. You definitely break rules. The way in which you have an idea generally is actually, in some ways, it's not creation, it's destruction. And the way you can have a new idea is take 10 things that everybody assumes must be a given and get rid of at least one of them. So I always say, if you want to help a client, go and find the thing that everybody assumes is true that isn't. And now you've just widened the whole solution space enormously. And so it is about at least breaking conventions, if not rules, because generally the constraints to creativity, as with your the Lucky Star piece, which CDD did, everybody assumed that an ad ostensibly had to be for the product which it was promoting.
Yeah. And
that was the first case I can come across. I mean, there may have been weird cases in the, funnily enough, there's quite a lot of ingenuity in the 1920s and 30s advertised. And it's possible someone did something similar there. You might occasionally get an ad for a shop which was really an ad for the product, possibly, but I can't think of anybody doing that before. And so by kicking out one assumed necessity, you suddenly find yourself with a completely new space for originality.
Well, it's interesting because your Harris example is almost like a slight Trojan horse, isn't it? Because they're obviously not really interested in anyone sending them examples of where they're featured, but they are setting you off on that course so that you walk around thinking this is special and it's in literature, so it's obviously famous and with a sort of almost a pretend reason for doing that.
So it was kind of an completely oblique approach to solving the problem. Yeah. I once did it when I was very young, and I still think it was a bit of direct mail. And of course, it was back in the days when you couldn't enter direct mail for anything other than direct marketing. Yeah. But we wanted people to reorder their Economist diaries. So we had this small account, which was the Economist books and diaries, as an adjunct to the Economist account, for which we had the direct marketing. Okay. And the whole thing was we wanted to write to people in October to nudge them to just put in an order for their, what would have been their 1993 Economist diary. Okay. And I just said, why don't we just pretend there was a mistake in their existing... Well, the one thing we know about them is they've got an existing 1992 diary. So I just said, why don't we write to them and say, apologize profusely and say, if the headline on the envelope was just erratum, and say, we've just noticed that there's an error in your current Economist diary and that actually we missed out details of a worm-eating festival in Samoa or something.
Funny. Yeah.
And we included a little sticker that they could put into their current diary to correct the omission, and then said, and while you're doing that, because why don't you just order your next diary?
Yeah. Excellent. And how did that do?
Yeah, it was very successful. It was very, very successful because, again, it was just that element of surprise,
And also, it's that thing that people's defences are down. You're not trying to sell them something, but you're reminding them of something. So their natural reaction to reject is lowered.
It's what someone called getting in under the radar, because you're essentially, everybody has to a certain extent a degree of acquired immunity to avert sales messages. And just getting in from a surprising direction. Neil French used to describe this fantastically. When he was an encyclopedia salesman in Birmingham, back in what must have been the late 70s or something, he used to do the strangest thing, which is he'd wait for it to rain, okay, and then he'd pick a house which had kids. You'd look for a bicycle outside or a bicycle in the garden. Nowadays, you look for a trampoline or something, okay? But if there were some kids' bicycles, you knew they had kids. So you knew they were in the target audience for what must have been Children's Britannica, I guess, which was the children's version of Encyclopedia Britannica, which you could buy kind of one volume at a time. And he'd wait for it to rain, and he'd knock on the door, looking really bedraggled and wet. And the first thing he'd try and do, because this was 1970-something, was cadge a cigarette from the person. Okay. And when he said, I couldn't just come in, I'm actually soaking out there. You haven't got a cigarette, have you? And he'd get them to make him a cup of tea and give him a cigarette before he'd even start selling the encyclopedias.
Yeah.
And it's what it is. It's the foot in the door trick in part, but it's also getting people 10% on your side before you start the ask.
Yeah.
And I think, it's one of those it is a kind of Jedi mind trick. But I was always very fond of that. God, it was back in the 90s.
It's interesting. It's also interesting relating that to his work as well, which is oblique, isn't it? There's not a very in-your-face hard sell.
No, everything comes at it from an angle. You're right. Yeah.
Interesting. So, right, next one, Rory. Should be potentially a slightly easier one, but so you've got to choose one: reasons or purpose.
I'm not in the camp which completely disparages the purpose argument, in particular because I think purpose is useful, particularly for internal communications, and I also think it does show the consumer does detect whether you are entirely motivated by short-term enrichment or whether you actually care about what you do, okay? And I think it is important, whether through genuine purpose or what you might call confected purpose. It is really important in both service industries and in product categories to show that you're doing what you do out of love of what you're doing, not merely out of an attempt to separate the customer from their money.
So what percentage of, obviously, this is a guess, but
I think
the percentage of companies, go on, sorry, what percentage of companies do you think have a purpose that isn't making money?
There are two questions. Should you have a purpose, which is, now the great argument for corporate purpose, which isn't merely immediate shareholder self-enrichment, okay, is John Kay's book, Obliquity, which is the companies that set out to do something tend to make more money than the companies that set out to make money.
Yeah.
Okay, so a successful business is best achieved and best created through an oblique end other than immediate financial preoccupations, okay?
Yeah.
And, we could look at, everything from Google to, Nespresso or whatever, patently they care about what they do. Okay, it's not just a matter of short term. How can we flog you something? All right, and it's a valuable quality, and it's also a good strategic aim to have some purpose that's other than financial. Apart from anything else, okay, unless you're the chief executive on the board, the financial rewards for are not sufficient to motivate. If you have any sort of sizable workforce, they have to derive meaning from their work because they're spending 8 hours a day doing it, at the minimum. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the extent to which you should effectively have your advertising laden with your purpose. In other words, don't look now, but your strategy is showing. The extent to which you should be exclusively explicit about purpose is a totally separate debate about whether you should have one. It's a separate debate. And my view is that actually, if we're not careful, we end up with this absurdity where, Monster Munch are trying to promote world peace. Or, and that's what I call, that's the sort of absurd, reductio ad absurdum, really, of purpose. Which is, it started off as a useful insight, and the fact that actually John Kay's book is really the book you should read about the importance of having, saying essentially, our job as a business is to be superbly good at this thing, and it prevents. There are all kinds of reasons why that's a good thing, and John Kay enumerates them. It's a very brief book, but it's very good. But the extent to which you should brag about it and talk about nothing else, okay? Yeah. Because bear in mind, okay, your employee's relationship with the employer is a 40-day-a-week thing, okay? The consumer's relationship with Monster Munch does not go that deep, okay? You get people sitting in the pub agonizing about their relationship with their boss for 2.5 hours. You don't really get people in the pub agonizing about how they feel that, their relationship with Monster Munch has gone slightly sour. In the last couple of weeks, and Monster Munch just don't seem to be listening to me. The other night, I tried to have a conversation with Monster Munch. No, it doesn't happen. Okay.
So, do you think that's a sort of trend in advertising that will die down a bit? Because obviously, there's been a big trend that that companies and brands are talking about big global issues and emotion that feels very fake and also not distinctive.
It's good for Unilever to have a purpose. It's good for Coke to have a purpose. You can argue that Coke, to some degree, and maybe those giants have a kind of license. And we shouldn't also conflate purpose with what you might call a higher order benefit. So if British Airways says we're about getting people together rather than about jet transportation, that's a higher order benefit. It's not necessarily a purpose. And so we're in danger, I think, of confusing the two. Winston Fletcher wrote a very interesting book called How to Capture the Advertising High Ground, which was all about this. It was about, you can move a little bit up the pyramid of needs if you're a large organization. But at the same time, I'm also conscious of something which is the opposite of purpose, which is finding selfish reasons for people to do altruistic things. And I call that scenting the soap. And there's quite a lot of evidence from behavioral science that it's much easier to get people to do, let's face it, okay, what percentage of the people buying a Tesla are really doing it to save the planet? And what percentage are, fucking hell, it's 0 to 60 in, 4 seconds, okay? Now, I'm not suggesting that the cleanliness and the environmental gains are irrelevant to my potential enjoyment of a Tesla. I'm not. What I would suggest is that nobody would buy a Tesla if, in all other respects, it was a shit car. Okay, right. Yeah. And why I call that scenting the soap is that you wanted people to wash, as we do now, of course, hand washing during COVID, because it would help minimise the risk of a cholera outbreak, and you wanted people to adopt hygienic habits. And indeed, of course, those companies like Lever started with strong social mission. Yeah. But what they found is if you scented the soap, and if you sold soap on the basis of, attractiveness to the opposite sex, the 1920s, the typical 1920s soap ad, or for that matter, Listerine ad, exploited anxiety. Basically, if you don't buy a product, you'll die single and alone. BO was invented by the ad industry as something to worry about. Bad breath. The line "always the bridesmaid, never the bride" became famous in a Listerine ad in the United States. Okay,
really? I didn't know. Yeah.
So they use social anxiety to kind of sell. Okay, and that's a selfish gain, but on the other hand, it achieves a pro-social end. And so, to be honest, there are all kinds of reasons why I might install solar panels in my garden. And one of them, undoubtedly, is to do with pro-social benefit. But a lot of that's about status, novelty, money saving, whatever it may be, And I think that is important, that if you can mingle a selfish benefit with a wider pro-social benefit, don't lose sight of the pro-social benefit. It's not irrelevant. But you might find more success actually going to people and saying, try this for selfish reasons. And then if you like it and you like doing it and you like continuing to do it, you can tell all your friends that you're doing it for altruistic reasons.
Yeah.
One of the things with by the way, recycling is that I was sort of nudged into starting recycling by the local council and their collection schedule and everything else. And then I discovered actually that you can keep paper if you've got a whole pile of cardboard boxes, there's no particular urgency because they don't decay or start to smell. Whereas food waste or waste with food on it, you want to take out to the bins as fast as possible because it'll leak or stink or start emanating hideous kind of, leaking weird indeterminate fluids, okay? And so I suddenly go, well, actually separating basically dry recyclables from manky stuff is actually a good move anyway. So I don't need any further call to altruism in order to continue the practice, because once I tried adopting the practice, it kind of made sense anyway.
Yeah. Interesting. I think it's, I suppose I've got a slightly allergic to purpose because it seems to have been applied to lots of companies for whom it seems irrelevant. So I think Unilever, as you say, they're I kind of recently looked into their background, and obviously they've got that running through them all the while.
And it goes back to the 19th century in the case of Unilever.
Yeah, probably more than people know.
Yeah.
So it's great for that. But when it's applied as a sort of like a coat of paint to all brands,
and the danger is, of course, it becomes devalued because there are the genuine players like Unilever who have been in this game for a long, long time. And then you get what I call the fake variety, which I call, planting a flower bed on the Death Star. It's where it's greenwashing, effectively. You engage in 2 or 3 really cute things, which don't really do anything to offset the damage you're doing somewhere else, but you just talk about them a lot. And that got the danger that it actually devalues the whole thing for everybody else.
Yeah.
Totally. So no, I mean it's in internal communications, by the way, the feeling that you're working for an organization. I do not get up every day to enrich WPP's shareholders. That might be what I'm supposed to do, really? But
breaking news.
Exactly. And so the ability to harness higher enthusiasms in your workforce and also actually having a strategy which isn't about shareholder value, but a strategy which is about creating wider value. That's your right to exist in some ways. And that's a worthwhile action. But that shouldn't necessarily infect all your advertising.
Yeah. Okay, we've got 2 more, Rory. So research or testing versus instinct.
Oh, that's both. That is a both. Now, the point is you need
right.
both because you need instincts, but you need to test your instincts in order to refine them. Okay. And so I mean, I'm an absolutely unrepentant bothist on that question.
Okay, so none would be 51-49, or you just go 50-50?
Ultimately, without good instincts, you won't test the right things.
You won't have anything to test. Yeah. Okay.
So ultimately, if you have to rely on one or the other, and in particular, a really good nose for what is a false assumption, I think. So where your instincts can really work is when you go, everybody's talking about this product as if people are buying it for X, but it's really about Y.
Yeah.
I think understanding that, I think, is really important.
And aside from the financial benefits, retainers or projects? I mean, there are benefits from projects in that you can handle more and flirt and try things and see how it goes. And obviously retainers is a different thing, different game.
In a way, I'm going to say neither in a funny kind of way. We have to find a better way to pay agencies because payment by the hour is incentivizing completely the wrong things. Okay, so payment by the hour would be worthwhile if there were a reasonable linear relationship between time spent and value created.
Yeah.
But the whole point of creativity is there is no such relationship because creativity creates value through kind of a leap, which is not which can be time consuming. I mean, I'm not suggesting that, but the idea that the value you create is proportionate to the effort and time expended is actually Marxist.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
It's actually Marxist. I mean, it's the labor theory of value. That's the irony of the whole thing.
Well, I've just done a podcast with an amazing guy actually he's now called Rick Sittig, but he used to be called Dick Sittig, who did all the Jack in the Box commercials and Joe Isuzu. He's got an amazing body of work. And he runs an agency and has done for 20 years in LA. And They only work with 3 clients at any one time, because he says if you work with, otherwise the only ways agencies can make money. His goal is to grow clients to make more money, so to cap it. And then secondly, they still charge as a percentage of spend. And I said, well, how does that go? Because I thought people had moved away from that and clients didn't want that. He said, clients love it because they know exactly what they're dealing with. He said, and exactly what you say, that that how much time we spend on anything is irrelevant to our output.
And of course, there are a few great incentives. We never noticed the advantages to commission. One of the great advantages to commission was you made a lot of money if you produced a long-running campaign.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's
it was an encouragement to continually stick to your knitting.
Yeah.
And keep, and generally all campaigns get killed off too early. Without exception. There was one case I heard of where someone said, "I think this campaign's beginning to tire." Receive the reply, "It hasn't actually run yet." The person had just got bored with it.
Too many meetings. Yeah.
And funnily enough, the great guy, he lives in Tasmania, fantastic marketing guy, Mark Ritson. Yeah. He refers to this fact that he was working with, I think, Laurent Perrier, and they wanted to get rid of yellow. Because, of course, if you work for Laurent Perrier, your mouse mat's yellow, your screensaver is yellow. You come into a yellow office, and they wanted to get away from yellow. And he said, look, the consumer isn't overexposed to yellow. They can just see a flash of yellow in their corner of their eye when they're in a champagne bar. It happened by accident, by the way. They had a run of dodgy labels, which were too yellow, and they shipped them out to the English market. And a load of English wine merchants said, can you send us some more of that yellow label champagne? And the Laurent Perrier people just thought, these stupid Anglo-Saxon wankers, if they're going to ask for yellow labels, we will make their labels extremely yellow, okay? Extremely jaune. So they printed these insanely bright yellow labels, and of course it became their complete distinguishing marker. It's pure Byron Sharp. Right?
Yeah.
And what Ritson said is, if you work for Laurent Perrier, you're sick of yellow, right? But actually, the consumer is not overexposed to yellow. It's the one thing that keeps you apart from the rest of the bottles on the shelf when it comes to someone ordering a bottle of champagne. And so I think the other thing with commission, by the way, which we never noticed, right? When we were paying commission, our clients tended to get us in early because they thought, well, we've only got the vaguest idea of what this product might be, but we might as well talk to the bloody ad agency because they're free, right? Yeah. Until we actually run some ads for the bastard, they'll go and help us out for free. Now, when the bloody meter starts running, they involve us too late.
Yeah. So have you come across any models that...
Yeah, we're trying to look at payment by results, obviously. Now... the interesting thing about that is it's generally, I think, you can probably do it if you've got a CEO conversation, but not if you've got a marketing director conversation. Yeah. Because the marketing director's terror is that, you are actually hugely successful and he has to write you a check for 5 million quid, So that's potentially there. Some degree of risk-reward share is a really, really healthy thing, I think. But then there is also that danger, which is, would that encourage over-intervention? Because there was that extraordinary thing about payment on commission, which is if you could run the same ad or a variant of an ad or a new ad in the same campaign, okay, and you did that routinely, the incentive was not to dick with the strategy that much. And there are so many other forces causing people to reinvent strategy every 2 minutes, not least the short lifespan of marketing directors in many fields, okay? The last thing we need is yet another one.
Yeah. Although the system does seem to be based on you get paid more if you get it wrong a lot.
Yeah, no, undoubtedly.
Because obviously you 1,000 more hours.
You are rewarded. Now, what happens over time as well, right, is agencies are run by people who mostly understand agencies through the lens of a balance sheet. Okay, and I have this rant about the whole business, including Ogilvy at this, which is that what then makes you money, apparently, is having very large teams of people on something, which generally is the kind of work which is laborious but not particularly value add.
Yeah.
And so it starts to give account people or finance people the impression that value is created in proportion to money earned. And so eventually the agency becomes incentivized into irrelevance because it's rewarded to do the things that aren't particularly valuable but are time consuming. And it's less rewarded to do the things that are less time consuming but more valuable. And so it doesn't matter for the first year or the first 5 years, but over 10 or 15 years, the distorting effect on, not least, by the way, the dismally small size of creative departments in all agencies. Okay, the creative people, and I would argue planners as well, but the people who are actually the product have become a smaller and smaller part of the payroll every fucking year since I've been in the business.
Really? You think?
So at WPP, I can't remember what the percentage is, but it's in double digits still, at creative people, but it's not in significant double digits, right?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting if you look at the correlation between what clients think they're buying in terms of hours from people and what they actually get. Obviously, the creative is one of the main things.
I had a very mischievous analogy the other day, which I described the agency model as the glory hole model of creativity, which is you're not actually allowed access to the thing you want except through a very narrow hole controlled by the account man, right? You're just allowed to occasionally reach out and touch the odd small protuberance or body part. But actually what these people would love, and I discovered this, that actually, so long, that there's this huge hunger for creative conversation among clients.
Yeah.
And to some extent, we're being rationed. And the account man's absolute terror that someone might actually, provide a valuable idea before you've actually sold a big, 2,000-hour project on the back of it. It's always that thing of don't go and ruin it by solving the problem.
Don't do it too early.
Don't do it too early. Yeah.
So can you think of any other businesses that successfully take a hit or take risk with their fees with the clients?
One way is just the flat project fee, which is if we solve your problem, this is what you pay us.
Yeah.
Okay. And that encourages both a sense of urgency, but a kind of efficiency too, which is if we think we can solve your problem literally by changing your call center script, that's what we'll tell you to do. And we'll keep on doing those things until your problem is solved. So that's one, the absolute flat payment for output rather than input is another interesting model. The other thing is it totally commoditizes us if you charge by the hour. I mean, it's a grotesque commoditization.
Well, also, there's a number of bad also, sometimes, as you'll know, as a creative, they say your best ideas are either your first or last. So sometimes by the next day, you can have an idea that you think that would work really well. But lots of agencies are not set up to say, look, we're very early, but it's worth having a chat because it will be a problem on ours. So not only do they lose out in terms of the hours paid, but sometimes the difference, 2 weeks difference of getting a client an idea can be really beneficial. If there's sales coming up or all sorts of things, but you're not incentivized to do things quickly. But is there any other areas you can think? Because it always feels like I'm slightly torn on. We'll take a gamble on what we do being successful. I'm trying to think of whether there's any other industries that do that.
We ought to remember that, of course, payment by commission was an enormous barrier to entry because you had to have a sizable media entity in order to do it. But the second thing was it was also quite often unfair. So if you would literally have a case where someone had worked for 6 months on something and then the client's factory burned down, and you ended up getting paid nothing. Now, that's not really a satisfactory situation. So it would be completely false to pretend that commission was and David Ogilvy was a long-term enemy of commission. The only issue, I think, is that there are a few issues. One of which is I don't understand why media agencies and creative agencies were separated to begin with. I get there's some argument for the centralization of media buying, but I don't get the argument for media planning being taken out. And I think that's also devalued us, because in the old days, we used to go to the client with a solution, and it was just add water, just add budget, put this in the microwave, and you've got yourself a solution to your problem. Now, the client's faced with a kind of Mongolian barbecue where everybody's suggesting ingredients, but nobody can cook a meal.
Yeah.
And, if you've ever been to a Mongolian barbecue, my experience is that everybody's been to one once, because you never go back, because you think, look, if I want to just cobble together a meal from random ingredients without the skill of a chef actually deciding the ratio, I might as well just cook badly at home,
Yeah.
And so I think there's a real issue there, which is interesting as well, which is the whole ability of us. What used to happen in the good old full service days was if your planner was happy, the creative team were happy, and your media person was happy, you knew you were onto something, right? You'd got something, right? And then if the account person was fairly happy, well, you were slightly worried in case it was too unambitious. But no. Generally, if the account person was happy, you knew, okay, well, what we have here is a ready-to-go solution to the problem, okay? We know the media exists, it's available, it's da-da-da-da-dum. Of course, the Economist poster campaign, if you think about it, was a media-led solution.
Yeah.
It was extraordinary when you think about it. The idea of using outdoor to sell The Economist was a completely left field idea.
Yeah. And you know how that came about. Presumably, you must know.
Was it because getting the copy approved was just too?
No. That was. This is how history records it. That David Abbott was. They used to do lots of press ads for The Economist, and then one day, whilst looking at the cover of The Economist, thought that logo looks like a poster, and then spoke to Ken New in the media department and said, "Is there any rationale that would make sense for us to run posters for The Economist instead of doing press ads?" And he said, "Let me go away and have a think." And then he came back and there was a rationale for doing posters. And David then wrote all the posters. But it sort of came away in a really imperfect, but, he just thought, well, that looks like an Economist poster. It's like a 48 sheet. Yeah.
And that's exactly the kind of serendipitous thing which we've lost. And the other way I always argue it is, look, if you do Sudokus, you can't solve a Sudoku by chopping it into 9 squares and handing each one to a different department to solve, right?
Yeah.
You need to look at the thing in its entirety. And I always refer to, most marketing problems are kind of Sudoku problems.
Yeah.
In that you can't separate them out into their component parts and hand them to specialists, which is probably a case why I'm in favour of the 360 agency or the generalist agency.
Yeah, it's funny. I was just thinking exactly the same thing, which is that, as imperfect as that sounds, looking at the masthead and thinking that looks like a 48 sheet poster in proportion. But obviously what's, I presume, is going around in his head is, how do we get more awareness for this thing? How do we get out in culture and the world? And thinking, actually, maybe whatever's triggered it, 48 sheets might be a better way to get this on the map more than. But it's sort of, because it comes away, its fruition is sort of imperfect and sounds not intelligent enough in a way, because it's not a direct answer to the brief.
But it's a brilliant. Actually, of course, if you look at the Economist subscription base, it's very heavily urban weighted, which means that you can make the case for posters. Yeah. And you can also make the cultural case for posters, which is, while you were engaged in targeted press advertising, you were reaching people who are reaching publications which were similar to The Economist. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So you never really injected yourself into the wider culture, because your decision to read The Economist meant nothing to anybody outside a small cadre of enthusiasts.
Yeah.
It had no wider cultural significance. And it's such an interesting area. But the payment area is fraught, and of course, as a behavioural science practice, we're also particularly exercised by it, because sometimes you can solve £1 million problem with 2 sentences.
Yeah.
Literally in a few cases.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
how do you charge? I mean, that's just, how do you charge?
No,
how should we charge? I mean, it's we've been, I think, devalued and devalued.
Yeah, and also we probably have also lost out, because the natural self-survival instincts of marketing and advertising clients cause them disproportionately to weight money in those things which show a measurable short-term return.
Yeah.
And so that awful trade-off between I'm not really interested in creating value for my company, I'm more interested in creating value that I can prove and attribute to my own activities, is a dangerous one as well.
Well, also, I think the way the business is set up, I wonder how many pitches now where an agency will come back and say, you should carry on with what you're doing, but slightly change it a little bit, rather than a fresh new campaign.
That's an interesting
I wonder how many people are confident enough to say, because, for example, do you remember the Foster's campaign went from, there's lots of campaigns previously where they would go from agency to agency and they just slightly refresh it rather than burn it to the ground and start again. I bet that happens less now because, again, that's linked into charge. It doesn't feel like you've done enough.
Well, no, I mean, it was very interesting because I remember sitting on the APG Planning Awards one year, and there was specifically a category in those awards for long-term effects. And it was created, actually, all credit to them, it was kind of created, I think, by Mary Baskin, who at the time worked at J. Walter Thompson. And she said, that's what J. Walter Thompson do. You know, if we don't have an award for long-term effects, okay, all the APG Planning Awards will go to someone who said, well, we were given this thing and we decided they were entirely wrong to make the campaign about X. We're going to make it about Y. And she said, we'd always come out empty-handed because we'd done stuff that worked over a 10-year timescale, but presenting by going in and saying, well, what we did is we decided that what they were doing was basically right, so we were going to do more of it, but in a slightly more cute way.
Yeah. Which can be much more valuable for the client.
Yeah. Do you remember that Lynx ad? That was a fascinating case of preserving something while changing it. So I know obviously the planner on it quite well, but they had those Lynx campaigns which were basically bikini-clad women on a beach with a nerdy guy, okay?
Yeah.
And you know, not unreasonably. You know, I'm not the lead campaigner for the the kind of political correctness of advertising, but it was patently clear that was going to tire or become a bit absurd or stale. And they had that fantastic one, which is, oh, you collect comic books too, you know. So you had this sort of dream girl, which still made play on gender difference, but in a vastly more sort of sophisticated and sympathetic way.
Yeah.
And that was a great taste of taking what you might call a brilliant idea in the rough and kind of turning it into a cut diamond. You know, and so I agree with you. That business of reinvention is hugely dangerous, and the incentive to reinvent, which has lots and lots of, there are lots and lots of motives for, changing things. And actually I won't name the person, okay? But I absolutely promise this was true. A creative director saying when asked to work on a pitch for Dulux, well, the first thing they got to do is get rid of that bloody dog. Okay, so creative people can be guilty of that as well, undoubtedly.
100%. Yeah, mostly creative people are guilty of that. But I suppose I like the idea of the sort of Mad Men idea where someone will say, take that word out of your end line and have a woman instead of a man doing that, and then it's done, rather than let's burn everything that's there.
Do you know David Ogilvy's Rolls-Royce ad? The 60 miles an hour, the clock one.
Yeah.
There's a whole load of stuff going on in there which nobody ever talks about because they all talk about the headline. The car is being driven by a woman and is outside a kind of New England posh shop. Okay.
Right.
The whole purpose of that was that everybody at the time believed that Rolls-Royces were only chauffeur-driven and that they were so big that only a bloke could drive them. And therefore, no one would ever buy one as a family car, however rich they were, unless they had a chauffeur. And so there's a whole load of stuff going on in that ad, which is actually tweaks, which have a highly potent unconscious effect. And
that's interesting.
That Don Draper thing of do you want a lovely story about that? Which is a case where, and I mean so the guys selling 1984, okay, went and presented. They had to go around. This would have been my friend Steve Hayden, who was the copywriter on the ad, who ended up in Ogilvy, New York. And they were going around Apple, basically, and they were presenting a thing, and it said, but on such and such a date, 1984, Apple introduces the Macintosh, so now there's a computer for the rest of you. Okay, that was the end line.
Right. Yeah.
And they're presenting it. It's like their 7th presentation of the day to, yet another kind of coder group within Apple. And this little guy with pocket protectors and a load of pens in his top pocket just puts his hand up at the end and says, wouldn't it sound a bit friendlier if you said, so now there's a computer for the rest of us, not the rest of you?
Yeah.
Okay.
So there you are, yeah.
And Steve Hayden and a couple of other people looked at each other and they were all primed to go, no. You just imagine, preserve your work, defend your work. They're all primed to do this. And Steve looked at his partner, looked at someone else and said, thank you, you're absolutely right. Okay.
But that's exactly what we've been discussing. How much is that one word change worth? It took 2 seconds. What's the bill that's attached? Yeah. But if it went out with the rest of you, it sounds like you plebs.
You plebs, You totally incompetent people who can't even turn the bloody thing on. Yeah.
Yeah.
And now there's a computer for the rest of us is just thing,
Yeah.
But Steve's very interesting talking about that because he said the Super Bowl ad actually took up about 5% of their attention.
Really?
He said most of the time was spent with, people from Apple worrying them about launch ads and, retail posters and retail support. And he said, we were more or less doing that ad in the spare time from doing everything else.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
Fascinating, yeah. We always forget that, don't we?
Absolutely. Rory, I've run through all my questions.
Any more wild cards of extremely unfair dichotomies, I think?
That was the plan. That was the plan. I was trying to put you on the spot because, and you've done very well. No, that was absolutely excellent. I'm so glad we got to do the rest of it.
The other thing I'm going to say about an agency, which is something from my friend Colin Nimick, which is 50% of what makes an agency great are what Colin calls the elves. Okay.
Right.
And, you always talk about the creative people, or you might talk about, the brilliance of the planning. And Colin Nimick always said, the difference between a great agency and an average agency partly comes down to the elves. I said, what the hell are you talking about, Colin? What elves? Have you gone completely deranged? And he said, no. It's very simple. He said, if you're at a great agency, somebody at 6 p.m. the evening before the pitch decides that since the target audience is teenagers, they want the entire pitch room decked out like a teenager's bedroom, like a goth teenager or a gamer or something like that, you see. And you decide, that would be a good idea, but it's 6 p.m. and the clients are in at 9 o'clock the following morning, okay? And he said, if you're at a great agency, somebody goes and tells 6 people, can you deck this out like a teenager's bedroom? And everybody goes home at 7:30 for a night of sleep before the pitch, confident that when they come in at 8 o'clock the following morning, the pitch room is going to look like a fantastic teenager's bedroom, okay? Because that's the elves, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you have an agency where everybody has to stay late to check that the elves are actually doing it, and then when they finally get in at 8 o'clock the following morning, everybody's knackered and nobody had any faith in the elves and people had to be making second-guessing the suggestions all that time. Okay, that can be a good agency, but it can't be a great agency without the elves.
That's interesting, and I guess that comes down to purpose that we were saying earlier.
There's a whole.
If the agency has more than, it's just trying to make money for its founders.
And there's a whole area of kind of, and Ogilvy used to be, it still is, very good in this, but there's a whole bunch of stalwarts who don't have a particularly clearly defined job description, nobody ever rewards them for anything within the agency. But a great agency is utterly dependent on those, And if you asked me to dream up my fantasy agency, I mean, should I name? It would include people like my current, my dream agency wouldn't just be Paul Feldwick and you and etc. Okay, and three of all of my colleagues from behavioural science, but also Richard Thaler, the Nobel Prize winning behavioural economist, and Dan Ariely. My dream agency would also be that could be a very, very interesting company, and we can probably get a good feature in Wired. But if we want to be a great agency, we've also got to poach Bob May, who's the Ogilvy guy who is sort of front of house for Ogilvy, okay? And we've got to poach, Anna, my PA, and Natalie, my previous PA. Yeah. And we've also got to poach like 20 elves, Okay.
Yeah. That's interesting. How I'll give you an example of that elf thing. Is when I was at AMV, and David Abbott had left had retired about 6 months before,
Yeah.
and I was in the studio with all the studio boys, maybe 10, 12 of them, and then working on one of the Macs. These young scruffy studio guys said to the other one, "Oh, David's coming in today at 12." And then the other one, then they passed it along amongst all of these people who didn't work with him day to day, and they all passed it along. David's coming in at 12, and they didn't have lots of direct contact with him when he was there, but it meant such a lot to them. So you can imagine if he would come down occasionally and say,
I've got a similar
"Could
story.
we do this?" Yeah,
I got a similar story from Craig Jones, who are pitching for a client, because Craig Jones sold to AMV eventually as a direct marketing agency. And they were pitching for a client in the AMV building. And they said, look, what we've got is tons and tons of creative boards to present. So it would really make a difference if we could just have some shelving around the edge of the boardroom so that we can prop these boards on. And by the time the clients leave, they're surrounded by our creative work in all its magnificence, you see.
Yeah.
And so they got in the kind of agency carpenter from AMV, and it was tooth sucking. Ooh, dear, you want now it's not going to look good because we'll have to drill through this. And what you've got to remember is this is a supporting wall. No. And look, the joists are over here, and then you've got to come up against the door jab. It's going to be. And then the creative director of Craig Jones said, "Oh, I see. I'm sorry it's so difficult because David did say it would be particularly helpful if you could do it." And suddenly everything changed. What? Mr. David wants shelves?
Yeah.
You said that Mr. David would like shelving put up. When they came in the next morning, it was like Chippendale quality cabinetry. Or it was like Grinling Gibbons had been there, carving the shelves overnight. And the entire thing changed. And the whole thing was just magic. Mr. David said he'd like some shelves. And I always think that's rather wonderful, Sort out the drainage in the lower field.
Absolutely. Well, that gets you your elves.
Yeah.
Sort of decent behaviour over a long time.
Ogilvy was always, and still is, I hope, but it was always historically very good to elves.
Was it?
Yeah. It looked,
and was that a David Ogilvy thing?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And it was also, I think it's that weird military thing or the sort of posh boy thing where it's okay to be shit to people just below you, but do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
That you treat the idea that being rude to a waiter is about the lowest form of rudeness. You can be, that actually kind of, there's a kind of English cultural thing which at its best means that you actually treat people, very, very well. I always remember when I was at university, a guy saying, he was an old fellow, and he said, the funny thing about this business of being in a Cambridge college, he said, I'll give you one tip. He said, you can fall out with the master of the college. You can fall out with the senior tutor. That doesn't matter at all. You can have a 10-year feud with the master. Doesn't matter. There are 3 people you must never, ever fall out with, he said. It's the head gardener, the head porter, and the head chef. If they don't like you, your life isn't worth living. Okay. And it's kind of true in a sense. Your capacity to make life pleasurable or miserable depends.
Yeah.
We have this now under COVID, which is suddenly we have this category of people called essential workers, people who deliver things, and they've always been undervalued by society, I think. Postman, your Amazon delivery guy, the Ocado guy, the people who, the people who drive vans and fix shit, without whom nothing else in economics is possible. You have to be honest about it, okay?
Absolutely.
And obviously nurses, doctors, etc. But there's also this category of people who are so important and actually so, often ridiculously undernoticed. There was a brilliant person who retired fairly recently from Ogilvy called Christine Dunn. And we were, funnily enough, before there was a direct line campaign featuring Harvey Keitel as Mr. Wolf, we used to call her Mrs. Wolf. Because we said you could go to her with, you remember this from Pulp Fiction, okay? You could go to her with this totally intractable problem. And she'd seen, she'd seen it before. She worked in agencies since, I think, the 1960s, late 60s, very early 70s. And there wasn't anything. We always joke that, if you said, look, it's a bit embarrassing, but there's actually a dead body in my hotel room. She'd go, oh, no, you haven't done that again, have you? And sort of, 6 minutes later, a van would turn up and a bunch of people in forensics gear and bleach would kind of clean the whole thing up. And you'd be moved to another room with all your luggage, so there was no record of you even staying there. She never had to do that. I shouldn't be suggesting. I shouldn't be suggesting that hotel room murders were a common Ogilvy practice. But
I don't think anyone will follow up on it.
It's an incredibly magical quality, by the way, in people, which actually makes or breaks agencies to a great extent.
Excellent. Right, Rory, I can't thank you enough. That was
It's been a pleasure. Anytime. Do you know a brilliant thing, by the way? I had a murderous experience of a call centre. That's why I was late. And I went to Israel and I said, one of the mistakes call centres make is they should offer to call you back. It's absurd. Yeah. Okay. All their metrics are about how quickly you answer the call. I don't mind. If I can just say, here's my number. When you're free, call me back. I'll get on with some other shit. I'm happy. I've got it done. Okay.
Yeah.
And I went and presented that in Israel, making a point about metrics, that psychological metrics, irritation, don't map onto business metrics, duration. Okay. Right? Yeah. You can you can basically change the nature of a wait by not reducing its duration, but by changing the quality of the time rather than the quantity. Very simple point. And I made this point about call centers. And they said, we do not have this problem in Israel. Why not? In Israel, it's illegal to keep someone on hold for more than a minute without offering them a call back. Beat that.
Oh, really? Wow.
Whoever that bugger was in the Knesset who thought that bit of legislation up, hats off.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant.
What a pleasure.